Good morning, friends. It's Saturday, and I'm back with Chapter 14 of my upcoming book, Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Pincer Movement. I woke before the dawn and realized it's Saturday. Time to grab breakfast, find a comfy place to sit, and let my cartoons take me into another world where good guys wear white, bad guys wear black, and mischief is its own reward. Mark was still sleeping, and I made sure to be quiet so I would not wake him as I checked on the caterpillars. Several of them now seemed to be encased in cocoons, which they slowly drug around the carpet. A couple of them were also crawling on the underside of the lace curtain that covered their habitat. It should not be long now before they're fully encased and transformed into butterflies. Grabbing my favorite cereal in an empty butter tub to use as a bowl, I filled it almost to the top and topped it with sugar before adding milk. Then I grabbed the bowl and headed for the living room. As I entered the living room, it felt alien to me. I realized this was the living room in the new farm, and not the house we had recently left. There was no television in this living room. The television was in my parents' bedroom, and their door was closed. It then occurred to me that I had not watched cartoons on Saturday mornings since we moved into the farm. I carried the bowl back to the dining room and sat at the table to eat. Looking through the dining room window, I watched the ducks, chickens, and turkeys out in the coop. The ducks were taking turns in the small pool, bathing and then getting out to make room for the next one, while the chickens and turkeys scratched and pecked at the ground. I knew they were waiting for me to bring their breakfast. In the field, Fort Stix seemed to blend with the tall grass and dirt around it. The planks forming the walls had begun to gray somewhat, making the walls look kind of like a small stand of trees. The sun was also shining on it, and I knew it must be warming up in there. Maybe today I should finally install the windows that I had meant to do weeks ago. The garden in the back window looked nice. I could see red tomatoes and peppers of various colors. The corn stalks were very tall, and long golden tassels flowed from the ears of corn. When I went out to do chores today, it would be necessary to pick vegetables. The cereal quickly disappeared, leaving only the sugary milk sludge at the bottom. I drank it up and put my bowl in the sink. The house was quiet, and I found I liked it quiet. No little brother asking all sorts of questions, and no parents telling me to keep my snakes and bugs outside. Standing by the kitchen sink, I looked out the window through the trees to my grandpa's garden. It was growing even better than mine. And it was, of course, thanks to him and Miss Gracie, that mine was doing so well as they taught me things. Although I was still unsure about how I had learned from Gracie, considering she was dead. In fact, this morning I was still unsure about a lot of things, especially my place in the world. I always felt better when I knew what to expect and what was expected of me. When life wandered off into the gray areas, this is when I became unsure how to respond. With Gracie, and now the professor, life had suddenly wandered off into the gray area. I went outside to feed and water the birds, barely noticing as they gathered around me. Then I grabbed the watering can and applied fertilizer tea to the base of my plants in the garden. After talking with my grandfather, I learned that this was enough for one day, and it was not necessary to water the garden again until the next day. This was a clear example of knowing what was expected. I stood for several moments at the corner of the garage looking at Fort Stix. I was going to do something there, but could not remember what. Why did it matter so much to me that the professor was smoking grass? He was not anyone to me, other than some guy that worked with my dad. Sure, I liked talking to him, and he seemed pretty smart, but that was all. I remembered I wanted to make the windows on my fort and entered the garage to find the tools I needed. Dad left his jigsaw lying on the bench, and I knew the job would go much faster with that than if I tried to cut the boards with a handsaw. I grabbed it, strung an extension cord from the garage to the fort, and then found the drill, screwdriver bit, and box of screws. Since the planks of Fort Stix walls were only fastened at the top and bottom, if I just cut them mid-wall, they would just fall. So I planned to screw a plank horizontally at the bottom and top of each intended window, extended onto the plank on either side of the opening. That way, the planks would remain secure as they formed the window. I worked to secure the planks above and below each window with the drill and screws. It was a bit frustrating since I had no one to hold the plank in place while I used the drill. But somehow, I managed, after figuring out it was easier if I started the screws through the planks first. Before long, I was cutting across the wall planks with the jigsaw, using the edge of the horizontal planks as a guide. When the first window was opened up, I felt an immediate sense of accomplishment. I was also feeling better about the professor. While I was working, my mind chewed it over, and I decided that if I did not feel any less for my father, knowing he occasionally smoked grass, as he had last night with the professor, then why feel any less for the professor? It really did not matter. Obviously, he had smoked grass before I knew, and I liked him then, so why not just accept it? The second opening went much faster, and by the time I was doing the third and final opening, it came almost naturally. I was thinking about Gracie as I worked now, and remembered what the professor said about dads sometimes needing something. Gracie had taught me about chicken feet and fertilizer tea. Then she was gone. Perhaps she just needed to pass this information along, or needed someone to know that she knew these things. A light breeze was blowing through my fort now, and it was quite comfortable. Sitting on my bucket, I noticed the light coming in through the openings was lighting the inside up very well. I left the fort and looked at it from near the chicken coop. With the light of the sun shining in, I could see the interior walls very well. That would not do. While I wanted light in the fort, I did not want people to be able to see inside easily. That was a security breach. I considered putting shutters on the windows, but that would block the light and breeze, making my efforts useless. Then I had an idea. What if I put shutters that lifted up? Then I could adjust them for the amount of air needed, and the shadow they cast would limit the light entering. It was worth a shot. In the pile of scrap from the bathroom build, I found several pieces of plywood left over from overlaying the floor under the bathtub. Using the jigsaw, I cut them into pieces large enough to cover the windows and hung them with hinges at the top. Using a simple stick to prop them open, I could adjust how far they opened by angling the stick where it rested on the bottom of the opening. Sitting inside once again, I was pleased to see I had sufficient light with a pleasant breeze. Then the real test came when I went to the chicken coop and looked back. Yes, I was rewarded with blackness in the openings and could not see in. I looked around for Mark as I wanted him to sit inside so I could see if I could see him from outside. Of course, he was nowhere to be found when I needed him. I gathered up the drill and saw and put them back where I found them in the garage. Then I unplugged the extension cord and began to roll it up. Coiling the extension cord, I watched as the end came in through the open doors to my hand. I was not expecting to see Mark following it. "Dad's going to be mad if he finds out you're messing with his tools without asking," Mark said. "I was going to have you help me with a very important test," I began. "But since you're going to tell Dad I was using his extension cord, I guess not." "What were you going to do?" Mark whined. "I want to help." "No, it's much too big a job for someone who's a tattletale," I said, holding in a grin. "I need someone I can trust who will not mess up the test." "I will not tell Dad," he pleaded. "Let me help with the test." I laid the extension cord on the workbench and turned back to him. Well, all right, I began. I'm not going to use the cord after all, so it does not matter. I need you to go and sit on the bucket in Fort Stix. He looked over at the fort and back to me. I pointed in that direction, and he went over and disappeared inside. I gave it a minute until I was sure he was sitting on the bucket and looked at the fort from all angles. It was a success. I could not see him in there. I went over to the fort and went inside. Okay, that was good, I said, and took my place on the bucket. So what is the important test? Mark asked, intruding on my moment of satisfaction at a job well done. When are we going to do the test? I started to tell him that the test was already done, when it dawned on me that the new windows did not yet have a way to lock them closed. Anyone could walk up and lift them to see inside. That was definitely a security issue. I reached up and closed the windows. Okay, I need to see how secure these windows are, I said. Go outside and see if you can open them. He walked outside, opened the nearest window, and stuck his head in to look at me. Like this? Yeah, I said, that's not very secure. I know. Climb down in the vault and grab those screen door eye hooks we stashed in there. To my surprise, he did not hesitate. He swung the trapdoor open and went in head first instead of climbing down the ladder. His legs followed him in like a snake's tail, and I could hear him jostling things around under the floor. In a moment, he stuck his head up and laid the hooks on the floor. Why didn't you climb down the stairs? I asked, grabbing the hooks. Because we had snakes in there, and I wanted them to know it was a friend coming in, he said, climbing out to sit on the now closed hatch. I did not see any snakes down there. Yeah, I know, I said as I worked to screw the first hook in the window. They all left after the first day and took the food with them. I do not think they liked it very much down there. Mark watched me put the hooks and eyes on the windows quietly. When I was done, I latched them and asked him to try opening the windows again. This time, he was not able to open them, and I declared the test a success. He was happy and seemed to have forgotten about me and the extension cord. We locked up Fort Stix and headed into the house for lunch. Mom and Dad were still in bed when we got in the house. I guess we should not have been surprised since Aunt Jo from Portage had come over with her 2 daughters after we got back from the shop. She brought a case of beer with her, and Dad had picked up another case on his way home. Grandpa also came over after dinner and sat having some beer with them. It was well after midnight when I last used the bathroom and saw they were still gathered around the stove drinking. Aunt Jo was not really my aunt, but rather just a real close friend of the family that we called Aunt. Her daughter and I met when we were living in the trailer park where they still lived, and had introduced our parents, who became great friends. Joe's husband Jim was a truck driver, and my dad sometimes worked on his truck. And yes, I called him Uncle Jim. Their other daughter was the same age as my sister. As I walked past the basement door on my way to use the bathroom, a frosty cold spot enveloped me, making me shiver. Immediately, I thought of ghosts, while at the same time, I remembered the pistol hanging above the stairs in the header. I went and washed my hands before returning to the kitchen to make sandwiches for my brother and I. As we sat there eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, my dad wandered in to see if there was any coffee. There was not, since they had not been up, and I was wrangled into making some. Then he disappeared off to the bathroom. When Dad came out of the bathroom to get his coffee, I was putting dishes in the sink. I stood out of the way and waited until he got his first sip. Have you seen the pistol hanging above the stairs to the basement? I asked, getting some water. No, he said, and turned toward the door. He opened the door to the basement and stood looking at it for a few minutes before turning back. I don't see any pistol, he said. I walked over and looked in. To the left of the fuse box, plain as day, the pistol hung on 2 nails pointing at the fuse box. Right there, I said, and pointed right at it. He reached out and took the pistol from the wall. Pushing the cylinder release, he flipped the cylinder open and made sure it was not loaded. I never even noticed it, he said. This is Uncle Rudy's old .44. He closed the basement door and carried the pistol to the desk. Reaching up, he hung the pistol on a peg of the gun rack hanging there. I stared in amazement at the gun rack. It had not been there when I killed the wasps the other day, and I had no idea when he had hung it. In the top rack was my single-shot breech-opening .22 rifle, and below that was the muzzle-loading 20-gauge shotgun, his Navy Colt .44, and my .32 caliber Baby Dragoon. I had not had the opportunity to go shooting with him since we left Flagstaff, Arizona a couple years ago. In fact, I was not even aware that he even still had my pistol or the shotgun anymore. "So when are we going to go shooting?" I asked, hopefully. "I've not shot that pistol since we left Flagstaff." He looked at the weapons and back at me. "Well, we live in the country now, so I guess we could set up a range out in the field and do some shooting." This excited and surprised me. We were going to basically be shooting in the backyard. That was great! I was about to ask him when we could do this when I heard a truck pulling up outside by his. I went to the dining room and looked out the window. A green truck that looked like a Forest Service truck was parked in the driveway. It was Dennis, my dad's friend. "Dennis is here," I said, and watched as he walked to the back porch and knocked. "Come on in." Dennis came in at the sound of my voice and said hello before turning to the coffee pot to refill the mug he carried inside. Dad came back in after getting dressed and found us sitting at the table. "How's it going?" he asked Dennis as he poured himself more coffee. "It's time," Dennis said, grinning. "Really?" my dad asked. "Time for what?" "Just got the report in the station this morning," Dennis said excitedly. "The biologists say the yellow perch are running hard on Lake Michigan, and they're bigger this year than any year they can remember. There are reports of spawned-out perch washing up on the beach that are almost 5 pounds. 5 pounds? My dad seemed unbelieving. "Yeah, 5 pounds, Dennis repeated. "Average caught in the nets was 2 pounds, with some reaching 3 and almost 4 pounds. My dad leaned back against the counter for a few minutes as he seemed to consider this. Then he turned to me and told me to get some 5-gallon buckets out of the garage and put them in the truck. Next thing I knew, we were headed for Lake George to catch crawfish for perch bait. Sitting in the back of the truck, I listened as Dad and Dennis talked of old times catching yellow perch. They said the perch were a smaller version of walleye, but tasted just as good and were one of their favorite fish to eat. At Lake George, we parked near a sandy shore that was close to the rocky shoreline. Dennis said the crawfish would be in the rocks, but we could hang out and play in the sandy shore until dark when the crawdads would come out to feed. Waiting in the water near the rocks, my mind drifted back in time to the summer when I was 7 years old. At the end of the school year, I was put on a commercial jet plane and flown to stay with my grandma for the summer in Lake Station. It was a wonderful summer, full of meeting new friends and doing new interesting things. In addition, my grandma had recently remarried, and I met my grandpa Jim. Eventually, I also met my Aunt Joan and her kids, my step-cousins. One of the cousins, Eric, was mischievous as I was, and he showed me how to sneak into the back of a drive-in theater to watch movies for free. On the first occasion we did this, we snuck into The Exorcist. Not the best movie for an unsupervised 7-year-old and his 8-year-old cousin. As the summer wound down and it was almost time for me to go back to Arizona, Grandma and Grandpa took Eric and I to Lake George to go swimming. We spent the day swimming along the rocks and exploring. Toward the end of the day, we joined a group of older boys and went sliding down the spillway at the dam. The spillway was covered in thick green moss that made for an excellent slippery slide down the concrete waterway. I was brought back to the present as my dad called Mark and I back to start looking for crawfish. Mark was handed a bucket with several inches of water in the bottom, and I was told I would help get the crawfish from the net into the bucket. Several more buckets were lined up in the grass behind the truck. Then Dad and Dennis grabbed a long seine net and walked into the water until they were waist deep. They used the poles of the net to poke the bottom and in between rocks as they moved steadily toward the shore. When they were a couple feet from the bank, they lifted the net suddenly, causing it to form a cupped basket in the middle, which was full of thrashing minnows and crawfish. Mark held the bucket at the edge of the water and waited for them to tip the net over it. As the crawfish and minnows slid toward the bucket, I reached out and helped them along. When the net was empty, Dad and Dennis held the net above the water as they moved back into deeper water and down the bank a little. "Kevin, make sure to throw back any bluegill, bass, sunfish, and catfish that get in the bucket," my dad said. "But keep minnows and suckers and carp as long as they're less than 2 inches long." I looked into the bucket and saw there were indeed several bass and bluegill in there. I grabbed them out and tossed them back in the lake. When I was done, there were at least a dozen crawfish ranging in size from 1 inch to 2 inches long, and a handful of minnows. The minnows I knew were excellent bait for crappie at our favorite spot, Long Lake. "After you cull the bucket," my dad said, "put it in line with the other buckets, get a fresh bucket, and put some water in it for Mark." I did as he said and watched as they slowly worked their way back to the shore. Once again, they lifted a net full of bait and it was transferred to the bucket, where I culled it and set the bucket aside. In no time at all, we had all 6 buckets with bait in them, and my dad and Dennis were sitting on the tailgate drinking beer. After a short break, they combined all the buckets into 3 of them and set the 3 empty buckets in a line. Laying the seine net over one bucket, they poured the contents of the first bucket onto it. The water went through, leaving the fish and crawfish on the net. Dad and Dennis quickly sorted the bait into the other 2 buckets, one for crawfish and the other for fish, and divided the water between them. This was repeated with the remaining 2 buckets until there were only 2 buckets, one with crawfish and the other with fish. Several bluegill, bass, and sunfish I had missed were tossed into the lake to grow larger. The rest went into the truck after Dad sprinkled some blue crystals in each bucket to oxygenate the water. When we got home, the buckets were left in the back of the truck while Dad and Dennis sat on the back porch drinking beer and talking. I knew we would be going fishing soon since we had the bait, but I did not know when. Mom met us at the door to let us know dinner was cold, but our plates were in the oven. Then she went off to bed. I did not care that my dinner was cold. I grabbed my plate and sat at the table to eat. I was so tired I kept dozing off while eating, and when I was done, went to my couch and was out like a light. I woke to the sound of a horn honking. Looking at the windows, it was still dark outside, and I wondered who would be here honking at this time of night. I got up and looked through the curtains to see Dennis' truck in the driveway behind my dad's. He waved, and I waved back. Going to my parents' room, I knocked on the door, and my dad immediately stepped out. "Go get your fishing pole and get in the truck," he said as he grabbed his pole from beside the desk and headed for the back door. "What about Mark?" I asked. "No, he's too young to go to the docks," Dad said, and poured himself a cup of coffee from an already brewed pot. I figured he must have made the coffee before he went to bed. I got dressed, grabbed my tackle box and fishing pole, and headed for the truck. I looked at Mark as I went by his room, and he was still sound asleep. I put the rod and tackle box in the truck and climbed in. Dennis was already backing out of the drive, and Dad wasted no time following him. We stopped at a convenience store on the way, and Dad got me a carton of milk and some donuts for breakfast. We were going fishing for yellow perch. The sun was just coming up as we pulled into the parking lot on the beach. Getting out of the truck, I put the can of soda Dad got me in my tackle box and grabbed it in my rod. Dad and Dennis added more blue crystals to the bait buckets and grabbed one each along with their rods and tackle boxes. We were on our way to the docks. I had made this walk up the beach to the docks on many previous occasions, the most recent being just after ice out when we came for coho salmon. Each time, as I looked ahead on the beach to where the docks were, it seemed like we would never get there. It was a little over a half mile from the parking lot to the docks, but it felt like miles. Earlier in the year, when we made this walk, I was able to watch lake trout in the surf as they swam in mating rituals. Now, there appeared to be no fish in the calm, crystal clear water. Then, as we neared the docks, I started to see dead fish lying on the sand. Approaching the first one, I saw it was a yellow perch, and it was bigger than any I had ever seen. "See, I told you there were monsters this year," Dennis said, pointing at the fish. "We will catch some big ones for sure." Seeing that big perch and his proclamation gave me a needed energy boost, and I found I could not wait to get on the dock and wet a line. From that point, it seemed only a couple minutes before we were walking along the concrete dock toward the corner furthest away from the beach. "Okay, just rip the tail off the crawfish and put it on the hook," Dennis said. "I heard from some other guys that the perch do not seem to want live crawfish this year." I watched as he put a crawdad tail on his hook before hanging the line a couple feet off the dock and opening the bail. He waited until the bait hit the bottom and then closed the bail and reeled up until the tip of his rod just started to bend. "Perch feed right at the bottom," he said confidently. "Just tighten the line and leave the sinker sitting on the bottom and we will get them." I baited and set my line just as he had and then sat on the cool concrete with my leg resting over the butt of the rod. If a big enough fish hit my line, I knew from experience it could bounce my rod off the dock to the water 8 feet below. My leg ensured if I was not paying attention, a good bite would be felt. Dad was just finishing tying his rig when I felt my rod bounce. I picked up the rod and set the hook. I definitely had a fish, and it felt like a decent one. After a few minutes, I reeled it up and was rewarded with a nice 12-inch perch of about a pound. I put it in the bucket and was baiting my line again when Dennis caught his first one. Then, before I could get my line set up again, Dad caught his first one. We continued to catch fish steadily until about 10 a.m. when they suddenly stopped biting. There were some lulls in the action of 15 or 20 minutes, but they always started up again. Dad said it was because the schools were swimming along the docks back and forth. I was stretching my legs when I looked into the water just off the dock and saw a huge buffalo carp swimming slowly by just under the surface. I wished I had brought a sandwich so I could mash up some bread and make a dough ball to throw in front of him. Sure, I was not interested in eating carp, but the fight of that monster would have been something. It must have been all of 4 feet long and weighed nearly 100 pounds. When we had not had another bite for 30 minutes, Dad and Dennis decided that 80 yellow perch should be enough for a nice fish fry. They dumped the rest of the bait in the lake and put the fish back into the buckets, and we started the long walk back to the truck. I am still trying to figure out the logic behind it, but when we got home, Mark and I were assigned to the fish cleaning table after lunch. We were given a bucket for scraps and a bucket for cleaned fish. My dad and Dennis, on the other hand, would have nothing to do with cleaning the fish, as they retired to the garage to drink beer and get the grill ready to fry fish. In my opinion, Mark should not have had to clean fish since he did not even get to go fishing. My dad and Dennis should have had to clean at least their fair 1/3 share along with me. Dad said since he bought the gas in the truck to get us there and all I did was help catch fish, cleaning the fish was my job. Have you ever cleaned and scaled 80 fish? Gutting them and cutting the heads off is relatively quick. In fact, I had most of them gutted and headless within the first 2 hours. Toward the end of the 3rd hour, when the last fish was gutted and I was starting to scale them, I thought keeping 100 fish might have been a bit much. Raking the dull knife along the sides of a fish to remove the scales is one of the most mind-numbing jobs on the planet. After you've scaled 300 perch and still have a large pile in front of you, you begin to wonder why you brought so many home. In case I forgot to mention it, Mark decided after scaling a couple of fish that he was done and went off to listen to Dad and Dennis talk while they drank beer. Since he was a bit slower than me at the process, I think I was at about 450 when he finished his 5th and walked away. It was at this point that I told Mark I had saved something for him from the fishing trip and sent him to get my tackle box. I knew he would bail on me cleaning fish and had planned ahead. When he returned, I got him my tackle box, grabbed his surprise, and dropped it in his hand. Mark screeched and threw it on the table as he ran away. It was a crawfish, about 4 inches long with very large pincers. It sat on the table looking at me with its claws held wide, as if asking for a hug, clicking its pincers angrily. As the sun began to set, I looked at the 800 yellow perch in the bucket that were already scaled and washed off. The pile there was much larger than what I had left to finish, but as I laughed maniacally into the night, I thought maybe keeping 1,000 yellow perch was a bit much. I hope you enjoyed this look into the campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.